The rain fell steadily outside Mercy General Hospital as Sarah Chen began her night shift. The young nurse pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders as she hurried from the parking lot toward the emergency entrance. The October wind was getting colder each night, and she couldn't wait to get inside where it was warm and dry. Just as she reached for the door handle, a tiny sound caught her attention. At first, she thought it was just the wind, but then she heard it again. A weak, high-pitched meow coming from nearby. Sarah paused, looking around in the darkness. There, huddled against the wall under a small overhang, was a tiny orange kitten. The poor thing was soaking wet, its fur plastered to its small body, making it look even tinier than it was. Its big green eyes looked up at Sarah with a mix of fear and hope. "Oh, you poor little thing," Sarah whispered, kneeling down slowly. She knew the hospital had strict rules against bringing in stray animals, but as she watched the kitten shiver in the cold rain, she couldn't bring herself to leave it outside. The kitten couldn't have been more than a few months old, barely bigger than Sarah's hand. As she reached out carefully, the kitten didn't run away. Instead, it took a shaky step toward her, letting out another soft meow that tugged at her heart. "It's okay, little one," she said softly. "I'm going to help you." Sarah slipped off her coat and quickly scooped up the kitten, wrapping it gently in the warm fabric. She could feel its tiny heart racing against her hands. Looking around to make sure no one was watching, she quietly carried her hidden package through the emergency entrance. The fluorescent lights of the hospital corridors were a stark contrast to the dark night outside. Sarah walked quickly, nodding hello to her coworkers while trying to act natural. The bundle in her arms squirmed slightly, but stayed quiet, as if knowing it needed to be secret. The break room was empty when she arrived, which was exactly what Sarah had hoped for. She carefully unwrapped her coat, placing the kitten on the small table. In the bright light, she could see just how bedraggled the little creature looked. Its orange fur was dirty and matted, and Sarah could count its ribs, but its eyes were bright and alert. "You must be starving," Sarah said, opening her locker. She always packed an extra tuna sandwich for her midnight break, and tonight it would serve a better purpose. The moment she opened the sandwich wrapper, the kitten's ears perked up, and it let out an eager meow. Sarah smiled as she shredded some tuna into small pieces. The kitten ate hungrily but carefully, its small pink tongue licking each finger clean. While it ate, she used paper towels to gently dry its fur, revealing a beautiful orange tabby pattern underneath the dirt. "What am I going to do with you?" Sarah wondered aloud. The kitten looked up at her, whiskers twitching, and let out a small chirp-like sound that made her laugh. "Well, first things first, you need a name." As she watched the kitten explore the break room, its confidence growing with each step, Sarah noticed how its orange fur seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, reminding her of the moon on a clear night. "Luna," she said suddenly. "That's what I'll call you. Do you like that name?" The kitten, Luna, responded by rubbing against her hand and purring loudly. Sarah's heart melted at the sound. She knew she should be starting her rounds, but she took a few more minutes to create a makeshift bed using a spare blanket in the corner of the break room. "Now stay here, Luna," Sarah instructed, knowing full well that cats rarely listen to human commands. "I'll come check on you during my breaks." As she left the break room to start her shift, Sarah couldn't help but smile. She might get in trouble if anyone found out, but somehow, helping this tiny creature felt like the right thing to do. She didn't know it yet, but this rainy night would mark the beginning of an extraordinary chain of events that would change not only her life, but the lives of many others at Mercy General Hospital. 3 days had passed since Sarah found Luna, and the tiny orange kitten had already made herself at home in the hospital. During the day, Luna slept peacefully in her makeshift bed in the break room, hidden behind an old filing cabinet. But at night, she became a different cat entirely. Sarah arrived for her usual night shift, carrying a small bag of cat food she had bought from the store. She expected to find Luna curled up in her bed, but instead, the kitten was sitting by the break room door, waiting. The moment Sarah opened the door, Luna jumped up and ran circles around her feet, meowing loudly. "Shh," Sarah whispered, quickly closing the door. "We need to keep quiet, remember?" But Luna didn't seem interested in being quiet tonight. Instead, she ran to the corner of the room where the service elevator was located and started pawing at the doors, crying even louder. Tom, another night nurse, poked his head into the break room. "Is that little troublemaker making noise again?" he asked with a smile. Like many of the night staff, Tom had grown fond of Luna, often sneaking her treats during his breaks. I don't know what's gotten into her, Sarah said, watching as Luna continued to cry at the elevator. She's been doing this for the past 2 nights. She won't stay in her bed anymore. Tom walked over and tried to pet Luna, but she dodged his hand and ran back to Sarah, meowing urgently. Then she returned to the elevator doors, looking back at Sarah with big, worried eyes. Maybe she's just getting comfortable enough to explore, Tom suggested, but Sarah wasn't so sure. There was something different about Luna's behavior. The kitten wasn't playing or seeking attention. She seemed almost desperate to communicate something. Later that night, Sarah tried to do her regular rounds, but Luna followed her everywhere. The kitten had learned to stay quiet when other people were around, but the moment they were alone in the hallway, she would start mewing again. She always led Sarah back to the service elevator or to the stairwell that went down to the basement. What's down there that's so interesting? Sarah wondered aloud, watching as Luna scratched at the basement door for the 100th time that night. During her midnight break, Sarah sat in the break room with a cup of coffee, watching Luna pace back and forth. The other night staff had noticed the kitten's strange behavior too. Maria, one of the cleaning staff, said she had never seen a cat act this way before. Maybe she's sick? Maria suggested, but Sarah had already checked Luna over carefully. The kitten was eating well, drinking water, and seemed healthy in every way. She just wouldn't stop her persistent crying and pacing. Around 2 a.m., when the hospital was at its quietest, Luna's behavior became even more intense. She ran from Sarah to the basement door and back again, over and over, her cries becoming more urgent each time. "That cat's trying to tell you something," said Joe, the elderly security guard who often patrolled the quiet halls at night. He had stopped to watch Luna's unusual behavior. "Animals have a sixth sense about things, you know." Sarah had heard stories about animals sensing danger or helping people in trouble, but surely that wasn't what was happening here. Luna was just a tiny kitten, barely old enough to be away from her mother. Yet, as she watched the small orange cat crying and pawing at the basement door, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By the end of her shift, Sarah was exhausted from Luna's constant mewing. She had tried everything, giving the kitten extra food, fresh water, new toys made from crumpled paper, and lots of attention. Nothing seemed to calm Luna down or distract her from her mission to get someone to follow her to the basement. As Sarah prepared to leave for the morning, she looked at the tiny kitten who had stopped crying and was now sitting quietly by the basement door, staring at her with those big green eyes. Something in that steady gaze made Sarah uneasy. Whatever Luna was trying to tell them, Sarah had a feeling they would need to figure it out soon. The third night of Luna's strange behavior left Sarah feeling more worried than ever. She hadn't slept well during the day, her mind troubled by thoughts of the little orange kitten and her desperate cries. As she drove to the hospital for her night shift, the autumn wind rattled fallen leaves across the parking lot, making the evening feel especially gloomy. When Sarah entered the break room, she found Luna sitting in her usual spot by the basement door. The kitten's behavior had followed the same pattern for 3 nights now, quiet during the busy evening hours, but becoming increasingly vocal between 2 and 4 a.m., when the hospital was at its quietest. "Hello, little troublemaker," Sarah said softly, reaching down to pet Luna. The kitten rubbed against her hand briefly but quickly returned to pawing at the door, looking up at Sarah with pleading eyes. Maria, who had just finished mopping the hallway, came into the break room shaking her head. "That little cat is going to drive us all crazy," she said, but her voice was kind. "Last night, she followed me all the way to the laundry room, crying the whole time, but she only wanted to lead me back to this door." Sarah sat down with her dinner, watching Luna pace. "I've been thinking about it," she said slowly. "Luna only gets really upset during those specific hours. And she's not just making noise. She's trying to show us something. It's like she knows something we don't." As if understanding Sarah's words, Luna let out a loud meow and ran to her, then back to the door again. The pattern was so familiar now that Sarah could predict the kitten's movements. Every night, the same routine, crying, running back and forth, pawing at the door, and looking at the humans with those knowing eyes. Around midnight, Tom joined Sarah for their usual break. Luna immediately ran to him, then back to the door, meowing urgently. "You know," Tom said, sipping his coffee, I was reading about cats and their instincts. Some people say they can sense things we can't, like gas leaks, illness, or even people in trouble. Sarah thought about this as she watched Luna. The basement contained old medical records, maintenance equipment, and a maze of utility corridors. Most staff rarely went down there, except for the maintenance team during day shifts. At night, it was completely empty, or at least, it was supposed to be. What if, Sarah said slowly, she actually is trying to tell us something important? What if there's really something wrong down there? Tom frowned. Like what? A maintenance problem. I don't know, Sarah admitted. But Luna started this behavior suddenly, and she won't stop. She's not acting like a cat that just wants to explore or play. She acts like she's on a mission. As the night progressed, Luna's cries became more insistent. By 2 a.m., she was practically howling every time she and Sarah were alone. The sound echoed through the quiet hallways, making Sarah increasingly nervous. Joe, the security guard, stopped by during his rounds. Still at it, huh? He asked, watching Luna pace. You know, in all my years here, I've never seen anything like this. That cat is trying to tell us something, clear as day. Sarah looked at her watch, 2:30 a.m. Luna's cries were getting louder, more desperate. The kitten ran to Sarah again, grabbed her pant leg gently with her teeth, and pulled toward the door. Maybe. Sarah hesitated, looking at the basement door. Maybe we should check, just to be sure nothing's wrong. Joe nodded slowly. Hospital policy says the basement should be empty at night. But if you're worried, I could do a quick check during my rounds. Luna suddenly stopped crying and stared at them intently, her tail twitching. Something about her sudden change in behavior made Sarah's decision clear. No, she said firmly, standing up. I'll go. She's been trying to show me something for 3 nights now. It's time I found out what it is. Luna let out a soft meow, different from her urgent cries. For the first time in 3 nights, she sat quietly, watching Sarah with those knowing green eyes. Whatever secret lay in the basement, they would discover it together. Sarah stood in front of the basement door, her heart beating faster than usual. Luna sat quietly beside her, no longer crying for the first time in 3 nights. The hospital corridors were silent except for the distant hum of machinery and the soft buzz of fluorescent lights. I must be crazy, Sarah whispered, reaching for her phone to turn on its flashlight. She knew she probably should have waited for Joe to finish his rounds, but something about Luna's behavior made her feel that they couldn't waste any more time. Tom appeared around the corner, carrying 2 flashlights. You didn't think you were going down there alone, did you? He asked with a small smile. I grabbed these from the supply closet. Better than phone lights. Sarah felt relieved to have company. She took one of the flashlights, its beam stronger and steadier than her phone's light. Luna watched them both, her tail twitching with anticipation. Should we take the elevator? Tom asked, looking at the service lift. Sarah shook her head. Let's use the stairs. The elevator makes too much noise, and, she hesitated, I don't want to alert anyone who might be down there. Tom's expression grew serious. You think someone's down there? Maybe we should call security. Not yet, Sarah said, watching Luna pace near the stairwell door. Let's just check first. It might be nothing. But deep down, she knew it wasn't nothing. Luna's behavior had been too persistent, too desperate for it to be nothing. They opened the heavy stairwell door as quietly as possible. Luna immediately darted through, her orange tail disappearing into the darkness below. The stairwell was dimly lit by emergency lights, casting long shadows on the concrete walls. Stay close, Sarah whispered, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to Tom or Luna. Their footsteps echoed slightly as they descended, the temperature dropping with each step. The basement level was noticeably colder than the floors above. When they reached the bottom, Luna was waiting by the basement entrance. The door was marked with faded letters reading storage and maintenance, authorized personnel only. Sarah's hand trembled slightly as she pushed it open. The basement was a maze of corridors lined with old filing cabinets, stored equipment, and utility pipes running along the ceiling. Their flashlight beams cut through the darkness, creating moving shadows that made Sarah jump more than once. Luna took the lead, trotting purposefully down one corridor, then another. She seemed to know exactly where she was going. The kitten's confidence helped calm Sarah's nerves somewhat, but her heart still raced every time they turned a corner. How does she know her way around so well? Tom whispered, as Luna led them past rows of ancient filing cabinets and forgotten medical equipment draped in dust covers. Cats can remember paths really well, Sarah replied softly. She must have explored down here during the day when maintenance staff leave the door open. They followed Luna deeper into the basement, past the main storage areas, and into a section that seemed older, less used. The air here was mustier, and their flashlight beams revealed cobwebs in the corners. Sarah checked her watch. It was 3:15 a.m. Suddenly, Luna stopped. She sat down in front of a narrow gap between two large filing cabinets, looking back at Sarah and Tom expectantly. The cabinets had been pushed slightly away from the wall, creating a small space behind them. "What is it, Luna?" Sarah asked, moving closer. Tom pointed his flashlight at the gap, but the beam couldn't penetrate very far into the dark space. Luna let out a soft meow, not her usual urgent cry, but a gentle sound, almost like she was trying to reassure them. She stood up and squeezed through the gap without hesitation. Sarah and Tom looked at each other. The space behind the cabinet seemed to open into a larger area, but it was too dark to see clearly. Sarah could hear Luna mewing softly from somewhere in the darkness. "We've come this far," Sarah said, taking a deep breath. She aimed her flashlight into the gap and moved forward. "Whatever Luna's been trying to show us, it's back there. We need to find out what it is." Tom nodded, his flashlight joining hers. Together, they squeezed through the narrow space between the cabinets, following the small orange kitten into the unknown darkness beyond. The space behind the filing cabinets opened into a small alcove, hidden from the main basement corridors. Sarah's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing old boxes and forgotten equipment pushed against the walls. The air was stuffy and cold, with a slight draft coming from somewhere above. Luna's soft mewing guided them deeper into the alcove. As Sarah moved her flashlight beam to follow the sound, she suddenly caught a glimpse of something that made her heart stop. A human hand. "Tom," she whispered urgently, grabbing his arm. "There's someone here." Both flashlight beams now illuminated the corner, revealing an elderly man curled up on a makeshift bed of flattened cardboard boxes and old hospital blankets. Luna sat next to him, gently pawing at his arm and letting out soft, worried meows. Sarah rushed forward, her nursing instincts taking over. The man was unconscious but breathing, each breath coming out as a painful wheeze. His skin felt ice-cold to the touch, and his lips had a slight bluish tinge. "He's hypothermic," Sarah said, quickly checking his pulse. "And that breathing, it sounds like pneumonia." She looked at Tom, who was already pulling out his phone. "We need help down here now." Tom nodded, dialing the emergency code for the hospital. "This is Nurse Thompson from the night shift." He spoke rapidly into the phone. "We need an emergency response team in the basement immediately. We found an unconscious man showing signs of severe hypothermia and respiratory distress." While Tom gave directions to their location, Sarah continued checking the man's vital signs. His pulse was weak but steady, and his breathing was labored. Looking around, she saw a small pile of belongings, a worn backpack, some empty food wrappers, and a battered veteran's cap. Luna hadn't moved from the man's side, her small body pressed against his arm as if trying to share her warmth. The kitten looked up at Sarah with those knowing green eyes, and suddenly everything made sense. Luna had somehow known this man was here, suffering in the cold basement, and had spent 3 nights trying to bring help. The sound of running footsteps echoed through the basement corridors. Moments later, the emergency response team arrived with a gurney and medical equipment. Dr. Martinez, the night shift emergency physician, took charge immediately. "What do we know?" she asked, kneeling beside the patient. "Male, appears to be in his 60s or 70s, Sarah reported professionally. Found unconscious, showing signs of hypothermia and probable pneumonia. Breathing is labored, pulse is weak but regular." As the team worked to stabilize the man and move him onto the gurney, his eyes fluttered open briefly. "Cold," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "So cold." "You're safe now," Sarah assured him, helping to wrap him in warming blankets. "We're going to take care of you." The man's eyes focused slightly, and he spotted Luna, who was watching the activity with intense attention. "Cat," he whispered. "Nice cat." kept me company. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she realized Luna must have been visiting the man during the day, keeping him company and possibly even trying to keep him warm. When his condition had worsened, she had tried desperately to bring help. The emergency team carefully maneuvered the gurney through the basement corridors toward the elevator. Luna followed close behind, refusing to leave the man's side. Joe, the security guard, was waiting by the elevator, his face showing shock and concern. "His name's George," Joe said quietly as they passed. "George Williams. He's a local veteran. I've seen him around the hospital grounds before, but I had no idea he was down here." As they rolled George into the emergency department, Sarah picked up Luna and held her close. The tiny kitten had done something extraordinary. She had sensed someone in desperate need and hadn't given up until she got them help. "You're a hero, Luna," Sarah whispered, scratching behind the kitten's ears. "A tiny, orange hero." Luna purred in response, but her eyes remained fixed on the emergency room doors where they had taken George. Her 3-night mission was finally complete, but somehow, Sarah knew this wasn't the end of the story. The emergency room burst into action as soon as George arrived. Dr. Martinez worked quickly, calling out orders while nurses connected monitors and started warming treatments. Sarah stood nearby, still holding Luna, watching as they fought to raise George's dangerously low body temperature. "Core temperature is 89 degrees, one nurse called out. "Blood pressure 90/60. "Start warm saline through the IV," Dr. Martinez ordered. "And get those heating blankets in place. We need to warm him up slowly but steadily." Luna squirmed in Sarah's arms, trying to get closer to George. The kitten's eyes never left the old veteran, watching every movement of the medical team with intense focus. Sarah moved closer to the bed, allowing Luna to see that George was being helped. "Pneumonia in both lungs," Dr. Martinez announced, listening to George's chest with her stethoscope. "Start him on broad-spectrum antibiotics. And I want chest x-rays as soon as he's stable enough to move." Tom appeared at Sarah's side, holding a clipboard. "I found his veteran's ID in his backpack," he said quietly. "George Williams, aged 68. He served in the Army for 20 years. Sarah felt her heart ache. How had a man who served his country for so long ended up sleeping in a hospital basement? She scratched Luna's ears gently, amazed at how this tiny cat had known exactly what to do. As the emergency team worked, word spread through the hospital about what had happened. Other staff members began stopping by the ER, curious about both George and the heroic kitten who had saved him. Maria, the cleaning staff member, brought a small bowl of water and some cat food for Luna. "Our little guardian angel must be hungry after all this excitement," she said, placing the bowls in a quiet corner. But Luna refused to leave her spot near George's bed. She sat perfectly still in Sarah's arms, purring softly whenever George's vital signs showed improvement. It was as if she understood the numbers on the monitors. After an hour of intensive treatment, George's condition began to stabilize. His temperature slowly rose to safer levels, and his breathing became less labored with the help of oxygen and medications. Finally, around 5 a.m., George opened his eyes properly for the first time. He looked confused at first, his gaze wandering around the bright emergency room before settling on Luna. "There you are," he whispered, his voice rough but clearer than before. "My little orange friend." Sarah stepped closer to the bed, allowing Luna to reach out and touch George's hand with her paw. The old veteran smiled weakly. "She visited me every day," George explained softly. "Kept me company, tried to share her food sometimes too." He coughed, and Dr. Martinez quickly adjusted his oxygen. "You've been very sick, Mr. Williams," the doctor said gently. "It's lucky this little cat led the nurses to you when she did. Another night in that cold basement." She didn't need to finish the sentence. A young social worker named Rachel arrived, carrying a stack of papers and a determined expression. "I've already contacted the local Veterans Support Services," she announced. "They have an emergency housing program, and there's a spot available for Mr. Williams once he's well enough to leave the hospital." George's eyes filled with tears. "You don't have to," he started to say, but Rachel cut him off kindly. "Yes, we do," she said firmly. "You served our country for 20 years, Mr. Williams. Now it's our turn to serve you." Luna chose that moment to jump carefully onto George's bed, curling up near his feet. The security guard, Joe, who had been watching from the doorway, chuckled. "Looks like she's appointed herself as your personal nurse," he said. "And after what she did to help you, I don't think anyone's going to argue with her staying." Sarah watched as George reached out a shaky hand to stroke Luna's fur. The tiny kitten who had appeared on a rainy night had done more than just save a life. She had reminded everyone at Mercy General Hospital about the power of compassion and the importance of looking out for each other. As the morning shift began arriving, news of Luna's heroic actions spread quickly through the hospital. The tiny orange kitten had become more than just a break room visitor. She was now a symbol of hope and kindness that would change the hospital forever. The story of Luna and George spread through the hospital like wildfire. By the next evening, when Sarah arrived for her shift, the break room was filled with gifts for both the tiny orange hero and the veteran she had saved. Staff members had brought cat toys, blankets, and even a proper cat bed for Luna, while others had collected warm clothes and personal care items for George. "You won't believe this," Tom said excitedly as Sarah hung up her coat. "Channel 5 News wants to do a story about Luna and George. They called the hospital this morning after hearing about what happened." Sarah looked over at Luna, who was curled up in her new bed near George's room in the medical ward. The kitten had refused to return to the break room, insisting on staying close to her rescued friend. The hospital administration, moved by the story, had made an exception to their usual rules about animals in the medical areas. "How is George doing?" Sarah asked, preparing for her rounds. "Much better," Tom replied. "His fever's down, and the antibiotics are working. But that's not even the best part." He grinned. "Wait until you hear what happened this afternoon." As Tom explained, a local veterans group had visited after hearing about George. They were outraged that one of their own had been reduced to sleeping in a hospital basement. Within hours, they had started a fundraising campaign for George and other homeless veterans in the area. Sarah walked to George's room, where she found him sitting up in bed, looking stronger than the day before. Luna was perched on the windowsill beside him, watching the sunset. A small American flag had appeared on his bedside table, along with cards from hospital staff and local veterans. "Sarah," George smiled warmly. "I was hoping you'd stop by. Did they tell you about the housing program?" Sarah pulled up a chair while Luna jumped down to greet her. "Not yet. Tell me everything." George's eyes brightened as he explained. The Veterans Support Group had fast-tracked his application for permanent housing. They had found him a small apartment in a veterans community, complete with medical support services and social activities. "I never thought I'd have a home again," George said softly, reaching out to scratch Luna's ears as she settled on his bed. "After Mary, my wife, passed away last year, everything fell apart. The medical bills, the house payments," he shook his head. "I was too proud to ask for help. But this little angel," he smiled at Luna, "she asked for help on my behalf." Later that evening, Sarah watched from the nurse's station as a reporter and cameraman from Channel 5 News interviewed George. Luna sat regally on his bed, her orange fur glowing under the camera lights. The reporter seemed especially touched when George described how Luna had visited him in the basement, sharing her food and keeping him company. "That cat knew exactly what she was doing," Joe the security guard commented, watching the interview. "Animals are smarter than we give them credit for." The next morning, Luna and George's story was the lead item on the local news. The response was immediate and overwhelming. People called the hospital asking how they could help homeless veterans in their community. The Veterans Support Group reported a surge in donations and volunteers. But the most surprising response came from the hospital board itself. Inspired by Luna's actions, they announced the creation of a new therapy animal program. The proposal included plans to work with local animal shelters to train and certify cats and dogs to visit patients. And guess who they want as their first official therapy animal? Tom asked excitedly, showing Sarah the memo. "Our very own Luna." Sarah looked at the tiny orange kitten who had started it all. Luna was still in her spot on George's bed, purring contentedly as he read some of the cards that had arrived from well-wishers. The scared, wet kitten from that rainy night had transformed not just George's life, but the entire hospital community. The best part, Sarah thought to herself, watching George and Luna together, is that this is just the beginning. Thanks to one tiny cat's determination and love, countless lives would be touched by this chain of kindness that started on a cold night in a hospital basement. 3 months had passed since that fateful night in the hospital basement. The winter snow was melting outside Sarah's apartment window as she watched Luna get ready for her important job. The tiny orange kitten, now wearing a small official therapy animal vest, sat patiently while Sarah attached her hospital ID badge. "Ready for work, little hero?" Sarah asked, smiling as Luna purred in response. The kitten had grown a bit larger and fluffier, but her bright green eyes still held the same determination they had shown on that rainy October night. At the hospital, things had changed dramatically. The therapy animal program was a huge success, with 5 more cats and 3 dogs now part of the team. But Luna remained special, the little orange cat who had started it all. They made their first stop of the day at George's new apartment in the veterans' community. He had moved in 6 weeks ago after making a full recovery. His small home was warm and welcoming, with photos on the walls and a comfortable armchair by the window. One special picture showed George and Luna at the hospital's therapy animal program launch ceremony. "There's my guardian angel," George called out cheerfully as they entered. He looked healthier now, with color in his cheeks and a bright smile. He was wearing a clean veteran's cap, and Sarah noticed new photos on his wall, pictures of him with other veterans from the community. "How are the art classes going?" Sarah asked, knowing George had started teaching painting to other veterans as a form of therapy. Luna jumped onto his lap, making herself comfortable as they talked. "Wonderful," George beamed. "We're planning an exhibition next month. And guess who's going to be the star subject?" He pointed to several paintings of a small orange cat in various poses. "Luna's becoming quite the model." After their visit with George, Sarah and Luna headed to the hospital for their regular rounds. The tiny cat had a schedule now, visiting patients who needed emotional support. The children's ward was always excited to see her, and elderly patients would brighten up the moment she entered their rooms. In the break room, which now had a proper cat bed and feeding station for the therapy animals, Sarah found Tom and Maria looking at a magazine. "Look who made the cover." Tom held up the magazine. It was a national veterinary publication, and there was Luna's picture, along with the headline, "Hospital Heroes: How One Tiny Cat Changed a Community." The article detailed not just Luna's rescue of George, but the ripple effects that followed. The hospital's therapy animal program had become a model for other medical facilities. The local Veterans Support Group had expanded its housing program, helping dozens more veterans find homes. Animal shelters in the area reported increased adoptions, especially of older cats. "Dr. Martinez says 3 more hospitals have called this week," Maria added. "They want to start similar programs. They're calling it the Luna Effect, how small acts of kindness can create big changes." Later that afternoon, Sarah watched Luna work her magic with a new patient, an elderly woman who hadn't spoken since having a stroke. The woman's hand slowly reached out to stroke Luna's fur, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled. The day ended with a special meeting in the hospital's main conference room. The board had decided to create a small garden area near the emergency entrance, the same spot where Sarah had found Luna on that rainy night. They were calling it Luna's Garden, and it would be a peaceful space for patients, staff, and therapy animals. As Sarah drove home that evening, with Luna curled up in her special car seat, she thought about how much had changed because of one tiny kitten's determination to help a stranger. Luna had shown them all that sometimes the smallest creatures could have the biggest hearts. At home, Luna took her place on the windowsill, watching the sunset, just as she used to do with George in the hospital. Sarah joined her, scratching behind her ears. "You know what, Luna?" she said softly. "Some people might say you were just a stray kitten who got lucky, but I think you were exactly where you needed to be, doing exactly what you were meant to do." Luna purred in response, her green eyes bright with contentment. Outside, the last snow of winter was melting, making way for spring, a season of new beginnings, just like the ones Luna had helped create for so many people at Mercy General Hospital.